Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will begin with our prayer to be followed by the national anthem. May we request everyone to put yourselves in the presence of our Almighty God. Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. God Almighty, thank you for bringing us together to celebrate Cebuano culture and heritage through the sharing of our stories. We need this in this time of uncertainty, O God, to remind us of our identity as a people, unique and blessed and proud. This reminder must inspire us that whatever challenges we face, whether unseen, alien, and treacherous, can always be overcome if we are united in working for the present and the future, and for the heritage of our children and community. We pray for our present-day heroes who are fighting against the virus, as well as other threats that besiege us today. For our own people struggling to overcome these threats, and for those who have died, fallen, but never forgotten. Dearest God, heal our land. Amen.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, telas ng sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa dikit mo'y buhay. Upang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisingil, sa nagagang tutok sa simoy at sa langit mong pangaw, ay nilagang tulad, awit sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iindig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan ang may di magtitindig. Luman ang araw ng walhaging pagsinta, mo'y langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya ng pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Maayong hapon mga Cebuanon. Welcome to Gabii sa Kabilin 2022 online activities. This is an engaging space to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage.
Mayong hapon sa tanan. Heidi Palapar here, GSK Event Director and your moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Welcome to the fourth and last webinar of Gabii sa Kabilin online activities for the year. Daghang salamat to everyone who has joined us this afternoon from Cebu and other parts of Region 7 and the country, even those outside of the country, and especially to our teachers from DepEd and the private schools. Gabii sa Kabilin, the summer heritage event of Cebu, continues its aim to preserve and promote local culture and heritage through the museums. This year's GSK theme is Padayon, the persistence of the Cebuano amidst crisis, which highlights why the Cebuano race, spirit, and personality have continued to exist and thrive amidst the many crises and challenges that came his way. The theme also highlights and celebrates local museums, galleries, and cultural sites, treasure troves where one can find proof of Cebuanos' knack for survival and character of resilience, optimism, and ingenuity. This afternoon, our webinar will focus on the Cebuano amidst political upheavals, how he survived the political changes over time, and the spirit behind the Cebuanos' resiliency. Before I introduce our speaker, may I just remind everyone that after the lecture, we have our Q&A, of course, with trivia where you can win prizes. Also, for those who are here joining us and want to get a certificate of participation, please note that we will post the link and open the evaluation after the webinar and up to midnight later only. And without much ado, may I introduce our speaker this afternoon. Acclaimed as the Visayan Titan of Letters, Dr. Resil B. Mujares is a household name in Cebuano literature, history, and anthropology. He is an award-winning author, scholar, historian, and literary critic. In 2018, he was conferred the Order of National Artist in that year, the first Cebuano to have received the highest award given to artists in the country. Dr. Mojares is widely known for his works in literature, literary criticism, Filipino culture and studies, even in biography and family history. His portfolio contains essays, journals, books, and articles across various disciplines. His written works include The Man Who Would Be President, Sergio Osmeña and Philippine Politics in 1986, and Vicente Soto, The Maverick Senator, published in 1992. In 1975, he founded the Cebuano Study Center, a cultural facility that does extensive research on Cebuano culture and is at the forefront of its preservation. The facility actively supports research in social sciences and humanities and provides public access to library resources to help aid and spread cultural awareness to Cebuanos. He is currently Professor Emeritus at the University of San Carlos. Ladies and gentlemen, national artist Dr. Resil B. Mojares.
Mayong hapon, good afternoon. I was invited to speak on the subject, the Cebuano amidst political upheavals. It's the kind of topic that raises a thought about whether there's anything in the Cebuano or the Cebuano personality that makes him act in a particular way when confronted with political challenges or a political crisis. But I'm not keen about making generalizing or summarizing statements on the subject. So I felt that it may be more informative if I speak on three particular crises in Cebuano history and consider how Cebuanos acted in the midst of these crises. So, for reasons of time constraints, the presentation will be somewhat sketchy, but I'm speaking with the assumption that many of you have kind of a fair degree of familiarity with Cebuano and Philippine history. So this, the first, which I think is a good topic to start with, is I mentioned three crises. The first is kind of the crisis created by the Spanish arrival and the onset of Spanish colonization. The second is the subject of the Philippine Revolution, the revolution in particular in Cebu. And finally, the subject of martial law in the Philippines and the particular experience of Cebu and Cebuanos. So I'm not sure as to whether this kind of what general statements all these can lead to, but it'd be interesting to reflect on these three cases. The first one is, I think, particularly useful because, in fact, there's kind of my jump off point is an article by the writer Nick Joaquin. And this is the time when he was also popularly known as Quijano de Manila, which was the pen name that he used when he was writing articles and other journalistic pieces instead of literary ones. And actually, this was a lecture that was delivered at the University of San Carlos in, I looked it up in 1979. That's a long time ago. And the title of the paper is Lapu-Lapu and Humabon, the Filipino as twins. And indeed, the Lapu-Lapu Humabon story is a classic story because here you have a hero, Lapu-Lapu, and kind of his foil is, and kind of in the standard narration of these events, in a sense, the villain is Humabon. So kind of on one hand, resistance as a mode of meeting challenge like the onset of Spanish conquest and colonization. On the other hand, acceptance as represented by Humabon. So it's kind of the binary of resistance and acceptance, or resistance on one hand and collaboration on the other. So, of course, if you speak in binary terms, I mean, you stand the risk of oversimplifying what in fact is a rather complex history where it's not clear as to who is the hero and who is the villain. But Joaquin's point is that in a sense one completes the other. That Lapu-Lapu and Humabon are the Filipino as twins. That kind of, you have to take the two together. That that this is how history moves. History is not just created out of resistance, but it is also created, or it advances and moves because of acceptance, uh, and and collaboration. So, as he says in his characteristic manner of speaking, that Humabon and Lapu-Lapu are the yes and no of Philippine history, you know, and that they have, and that they are kind of twins, that they two have to go together. So that he says we should not celebrate, for instance, a Lapu-Lapu Day. It should be a Lapu-Lapu and Humabon Day, because each completes the other. So indeed, if kind of, it seems like kind of a piece of comic book history, and kind of, if you are serious about the history of those events, you recognize that kind of the choices are not that simple. I mean, when you speak of resistance, what exactly does that mean? And resistance can take so many forms, and it may be the right response at one moment, it may not be the correct response at another. I mean, exactly what are the conditions, are what are the options, the alternatives, the attendant conditions. All these complicate the kind of response that perhaps is needed at a particular time, and given the nature of the challenge and a lot of other variables. So that, for instance, in the case of Philippine history, or the piece of Cebuano history that I just mentioned, uh, kind of why Lapu-Lapu resisted, what his motives were, and why Humabon consented to kind of accept the Spaniards, to the point that he even had himself converted as Catholic. So what his motives are, all these are not exactly transparent, no? And so that the question of motives is always kind of somewhat complex and slippery. But but uh, but indeed, kind of these two sides of Philippine history, if you can speak of it in those terms, are kind of an ongoing theme in history in general. As I said, kind of history is not just advanced, or it does not just move uh, out of resistance, but also out of acceptance as to who in the long term is correct is not easy uh, to answer. In fact, kind of Lapu-Lapu, of course, is romanticized as the hero of the story. But it's interesting to consider how kind of what after the Battle of Magellan, Lapu-Lapu is lost to history. We don't know exactly what happened to him. And when Legazpi came, what something like 40 plus years later, and started formally the colonization of the Philippines, the chieftain of Cebu was Tupas, who was the nephew of Humabon. So apparently, kind of Humabon's power in Cebu um, was maintained or survived, whereas Lapu-Lapu completely disappeared from history. So in a sense, it was Humabon in the long term who triumphed over Lapu-Lapu. So kind of actions that we people take in history do not always have the what kind of the anticipated kind of outcome. So so the point there is that it's kind of then important to bear in mind that kind of that it oversimplifies history if we kind of view it in usually the comic book sense of like there being heroes and villains. So that often the kind of the truths that we have to learn from are much more complex, and the challenges much more kind of difficult to address. So so that in a sense is the running theme in this story. When it comes to the next crisis that I mentioned, kind of this Cebuano response to the revolution, in 1892, a Spanish journalist named Alfredo Velasco, who was the editor of the first Cebu newspaper, El Bulletin de Cebu, wrote, and this was in 1892, he said, Cebuanos are respectful, submissive, and obedient. And he pointed to the fact that Cebu did not have the kind of crime incidents that one finds in places like Panay and Negros, and that the towns of Cebu remit their taxes with fair regularity. So, kind of this kind of sounds like an oversimplification of the Cebuano character, but it does indicate something about how by the late 19th century, the political situation kind of had so stabilized that there were no kind of serious indications of unrest or opposition or dissent. No, so that, for instance, when the revolution broke out in Luzon in 1896, with the uprising in Manila and environs led by Andres Bonifacio, I mean, there was nothing that happened in Cebu. I mean, like Cebu was very quiet, and so there were no signs of unrest as in Luzon. So, in fact, the most notable happening in 1896 in Cebu was that Cebu residents organized a force of loyalist volunteers to be sent to Luzon in order to help the Spaniards quell the Tagalog rebellion. So that, in fact, a large group of volunteers was sent from Cebu to Luzon in order to help the Spaniards quell the uprising. And what makes this interesting is that kind of these loyalist volunteers included some of the most prominent residents of Cebu. You know, Osmeña, Velez, Veloso, kind of these families were all active in raising money to fund the volunteers in their expedition to Manila. So they raised money, bought for uniforms and for kind of the other paraphernalia that the volunteers will need when they go to Luzon. So if you read, for instance, the article in El Bulletin de Cebu about this loyalist militia, the list of donors to the fund drive and the list of people who actually joined the loyalist volunteers reads like a who's who of Cebu. So mostly Spanish residents of Cebu, but also like kind of Chinese mestizos, you know, kind of and native Cebuanos were. So all this would seem to support Alfredo Velasco's statement in 1892 that um, that Cebu was as in his words, submissive and obedient subjects of uh, of Spain. And of course, kind of that is just one view of what the situation was like in the 1890s. I think there's a kind of that Cebuanos tended to be politically conservative. I mean, there's some kind of justification for such a statement because in the 1890s or the late 19th century, this was a time of relative prosperity in Cebu because of the boom in the agricultural trade. And so there was very little sign of unrest, if at all, kind of. And also because uh, kind of you have to note that the Spanish presence in Cebu was very thin, and the ones who actually, in a sense, controlled the local economy were the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in Cebu, say in the 1890s or 1880s, were actually Cebuanos rather than Spaniards, because there were very few Spaniards in Cebu, and so kind of the most influential and richest residents of Cebu were locals. They were not Spaniards, like Osmeña, Veloso, Llorente, uh, and 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 so on. So so when the revolution finally started in Cebu in 1898, and that's the 3 de Abril, April 1898. So in a sense, we joined the revolution, or we joined the nation, as it were, late, no, because in 1896 we were still completely loyal to Spain, at least based on those accounts. But by 1898, the mood had changed, and that was when the the uprising in Cebu started in 3 de Abril, the April 3, 1898. But but the cast of characters now, the ones who joined the revolution, constituted a distinct social formation, meaning, uh, and this is the problem with like making the again dichotomous statements about the elite and the masses, because in a sense the revolution in Cebu was started by what you might call the elite, but this is the elite of the towns, not the elite of the city. Meaning they were not probably compared to a Veloso or an Osmeña, they were not as prominent, as wealthy, or as rich, but in their own towns, they were like leaders of these towns. They were like cabezas de barangay, gobernadorcillo. They were fairly well educated. So they were kind of municipal elites rather than the elite of the city itself, because there's a clear difference between the elite of the city, who are really exceptionally wealthy and with big land holdings and so on, and the elite of places like Talisay or San Nicolas, who are also propertied but not on the same level as the city elite. So, so the revolution in Cebu was started by these municipal elites, you know, kind of. In fact, one of the best books that have been written about the revolution in Cebu is the book authored by the American scholar Michael Cullinane, entitled Arenas of Conspiracy, which is kind of an important book if you're interested in in the revolution. And what is remarkable is that Michael Cullinane, who studied Cebu for many years, published this book after after having compiled over many years uh, a list of who the people were who participated in the revolution in Cebu, and he identifies 340 participants, and these were participants in the first months of the insurrection, and identifies not only who these people were, their names, but also their education, occupation, residence, and so on. And what is really remarkable is that of those who participated in the revolution, in the first months of the revolution in Cebu, 88% were salaried employees and municipal office holders. Meaning these were not common people. You know, they were like councilors, municipal secretary, some of them were clerks, and so on. And that 70% had some secondary or tertiary education. So a fairly well-educated formation of people. By the standards of today, they probably would not kind of rank very highly. But you have to consider that at this time, like late 19th century, if you are a secondary school graduate, you are already well educated, you know. And a secondary school graduate, like senior high school student of today. I mean, to be a senior high school graduate in 1898, I mean, you're already kind of part of a very small segment of the population. And if you are a clerk today, like clerk seems like a lowly, very lowly occupation. But if you're a clerk in the 1890s, I mean, you're already kind of a highly respected person, because it means, for to begin with, you're literate. You can read and write. You have a fair degree of schooling. And what's the percentage of the total population who would have such qualifications? So this was, in a sense, a kind of not at all, you know, your idea of the masses. They were kind of, in a sense, kind of a rather privileged segment of the population, although definitely far below in status compared to the kind of the Osmanians would be called kind of a regional elites. They were not just elites of the city. Their influence spanned the entire region, because kind of wealth then was based on primarily on trade. And so they had their networks covering northern Mindanao, Visayas. So they were really kind of regional elites rather than so, like, there's a large big difference between like an Abiliana of San Nicolas and a Veloso of Cebu City. So the city elite remained loyal to Spain. The municipal kind of ilustrados or elite were the ones who were the most prominent participants in the revolution. So kind of of course, kind of immediately gives us the idea that kind of social location, social status, these are very important variables in determining how people respond to certain challenges. In fact, I think a very stark and simple example is has to do with the coming of the Americans. The Americans came in 1899, and in Cebu, the first American gunboat arrived in Cebu February 1899. And the first thing that the Americans did when they arrived, this was already, war was ongoing. The war was already kind of in progress in Luzon, but it spread to the Visayas somewhat late because the American troops were tied down by the war in Luzon. So, but finally, by February 1899, the Americans had arrived in Cebu, and the first thing they did was to demand the surrender of the city, hmm, because kind of the Americans, in a sense, had already annexed the Philippines as their possession. So when they arrived in Cebu, they sent a letter of demand asking the city and the leaders of the city to to surrender the city by such and such an hour, I think the following day, or else they would start bombing the city. No, so in fact, the leaders of Cebu kind of were, of course, kind of in a frenzy as to exactly how they would respond. And so there was a fierce debate in Cebu as to whether to surrender or not. The one who were very militant and insisted that they should put up a fight were kind of in a sense, the people who already were involved in the revolution, who came from the towns and, in fact, from the uplands, because one of the leaders was uh, the Tabal brothers, and they were like kind of the chiefs in kind of up the up in kind beyond Talamban and that in the mountains. And so the stark difference is that the wealthy residents of the city, of course, uh, felt that they should surrender because kind of they can't really put up a fight against the Americans. You know, the Americans will come with their boat, they are going to bombard the city, and kind of the city faced destruction by through the bombing from the American gunboat if they don't surrender. And of course, they are the ones who had the lots to lose because kind of they were the ones who owned properties in the city. The mountain people, of course, were not bothered about whether they were going to bomb the city because after all they had no properties here. So it shows a clear difference in response based on kind of the economic position of kind of the people. So in a way, kind of similar to the case of Lapu-Lapu and Humabon, when in the aftermath of the Battle of Mactan and the subsequent arrival of Legazpi, it seemed to have been that Humabon had prevailed over Lapu-Lapu. In the case of the Philippine Revolution also, those who really prospered after the Americans had established the government were the same people who were kind of the wealthy and prominent people during the the Spanish period. The classic illustration here is that of Sergio Osmeña Sr., the President Sergio Osmeña, whose career started at around this time. Because Sergio Osmeña started his career as a protege of the Spanish Governor General of Cebu. And he was kind of already regarded as a rising, promising young man. He was kind of well educated, bright, and ambitious. So kind of and so like when the revolution started on in 1898 April, Sergio Osmeña wrote an article in the Manila newspaper. No, this I'm talking about 1896 when the rebellion started in Luzon. Sergio Osmeña wrote an article in the Manila newspaper condemning the Tagalogs as kind of ingrates and bastards for rising against Spain, and so he kind of tried to navigate the political waters, as it were, so as to, in a sense, not to antagonize the revolutionaries at the height of the revolution, at the same time that he was already positioning himself for what he knew was going to happen, that the Americans were going to prevail and establish kind of an American sponsored government here. And so kind of Osmania Osmania kind of political career was launched at the time, because like in the first serious election after the American occupation, Osmeña won as governor of Cebu, and this was in 1906, and that was how, in a sense, his dominance in Cebu started. And I think it speaks, in a way, of the political stability of Cebu in general, if you consider that the Osmeñas have really been the dominant force in Cebu, specifically the city of Cebu, from 1906 practically almost until the present. I think the Osmeña dominance in Cebu was broken only first during the Second World War, because the Japanese, of course, occupied the Philippines. Second, during martial law, because, of course, the Osmeñas being prime enemies of Marcos kind of lost their power. So, except for those interruptions, the Osmeña dominance, political dominance in Cebu, remained from 1906 until the present, although kind of seemed to have started to wane because of matters of problems of succession kind in recent years. No? So that's kind of remarkable. I mean, I don't think you can find many examples of political longevity as the Osmeña had in Cebu, although their dominance was Cebu City, because they kind of they were vulnerable when it came to the province itself. But until recently, when the position of governor became very important, in the early years of the 20th century, up until 1950s, 1960s, what was politically important was to be mayor of Cebu, not to be governor of the province. Because income-wise, revenue-wise, Cebu City was much richer than Cebu province. And also because Cebu City, of course, had the advantage of being the center of media and mass media. So in terms of like exposure, so the more kind of politically significant position in Cebu was really mayor of the city rather than governor of the province. Of course, today probably I'm not familiar with exactly what the revenues are for the province as against the city, but also the rise of Metro Cebu has turned Cebu City into a less dominant position than it had in the early decades. But the thing is that in terms of kind of in terms of politics in that sense, like party politics, Cebu has had a largely stable kind of history. And there's a kind of course, factional party bickering, but overall, it has been kind of largely politically stable over the past century. This, of course, ended with the declaration of martial law in 1972, because then the Osmeña lost power. And the thing is, like at the time, at the time martial law was declared, even after, the reputation of Cebu was that Cebu was opposition country, you know, uh, particularly because the last real election before martial law was the election of 1969, and that was an election that pitted Ferdinand Marcos running for his second term against Sergio Osmeña Jr. And that was a very violent and corrupt election. That in fact there are still people who believe that it's actually Osmeña who won that '69 election. But in any case, Marcos won, and so that also, of course, cemented the role of Cebu as opposition country. So that's why, kind of, when martial law is declared, Cebu is regarded as opposition country, but of course it had lost its leadership because kind of the Osmanias either kind of left for the U.S. and so kind of they were able to reinstall themselves in power only after the end of martial law. So so in a sense, kind of Cebu was not kind of, it was in a way opposition country, but only insofar as traditional political, opposition in the traditional sense, not in the sense of like radical politics, because Cebu has never really been kind of NPA or kind of NDF country, right? And the reason for that, of course, you can't really mount kind of an armed struggle in Cebu because it doesn't have much by way of mountains and forests. So kind of it does not have a deep hinterland, so that so you can't mount a long kind of armed struggle in the mountains of Cebu, because so that's why kind of Cebu was not NPA country. Anyway, uh, so when martial law was declared, and with kind of you know kind of uh, newspapers, radio, television were closed down, so there was no media. Schools were closed down, so there were no occasions for people to congregate. Curfew was imposed. That really was a radically new experience for everyone. So there's no overt opposition in Cebu in the early years of martial law, because of well, it's a state of martial law. But but kind of, I think Cebu's reputation as opposition country somewhat persisted, because one of the most interesting happenings during the martial law period was the election for the interim Batasang Pambansa of 1978. Because Marcos started to reorganize government of democratic rule by having plebiscites and elections. But these, of course, were like kind of largely stage-managed events. So one of the changes was the creation of a national assembly, where representatives were by region instead of by district or by provincial districts. So like delegates from Region 7, so they were to be chosen in the election to constitute the interim National Assembly. So this was an interesting electoral context because there were two parties in contention. Was the Marcos Party, the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, which had a stellar cast of the big names in Cebu and Visayan politics. Imagine like there were 13 seats available. The candidates of the KBL, of the Marcoses party, were uh, Osmeña, Gulyas, Garcia, uh, who else? But kind of the big names, really the big names of local politics were in the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan. Whereas an opposition was kind of a ragtag group called Posyon Bisaya, which was made largely of kind of political neophytes and kind of non-entities, no. So in fact, today the recognizable name there is the Hilario Davide, but at the time Davide was just a young lawyer, and so they were kind of, in comparative terms, practically political nobodies running against the big political uh, families, no, names. And what happened was, though this was martial law period, the result of the election in Central Visayas was 13 for Pusyon Bisaya, 0 for Marcos's party. A complete sweep. That really was remarkable because, in fact, in the whole country, it was only Central Visayas that elected practically the only region where the opposition won. No, and it was not just that they won, but complete shutout, 13-0. So Osmeña, Gulyas, Garcia, all the others, Cuenco, they all lost to candidates who were nobody, non-entities. In fact, people were so happy when that happened that it was almost like they were dancing in Puente Osmeña when the Posyon Bisaya won, because it's as though people were so glad that they were able to get back at Marcos by electing a complete opposition slate. And in fact, the one popular talk was that people were saying that had they fielded dogs, the dogs would have won over Marcos's candidate. So it showed that there was a wellspring of opposition sentiments in the region, which kind of enhanced the reputation of Cebu and kind of Region 7 in general as kind of anti-Marcos or opposition party. And so when the EDSA revolution happened in 1986, and of course that's largely a Metro Manila phenomenon. And I think Cebuanos were disappointed because, of course, they could not participate directly in the event, although of course, the support for the people in EDSA was very strong. In fact, when in the first days of the People Power Revolution, the word was that the that Camp Sergio Osmeña, Camp Sergio Osmeña on Jones Avenue, that it had turned rebel. I mean, it had joined the rebels in EDSA, and that when word was received over radio that camp, that soldiers from Camp Lapu-Lapu, which is the Philippine Army base, no, Camp Sergio Osmeña is Philippine Constabulary. So, like, Philippine Constabulary had he said, joined the EDSA rebels, and that Camp Lapu-Lapu was sending a force to, in a sense, to to take over Camp Sergio Osmeña. And when that rumor, I don't know whether it was true or whether it was simply a rumor, but when that rumor spread, a lot of people flocked to Camp Sergio Osmeña to mount their own EDSA revolution. So they were glad that they could do something that was, and not just watch what was happening in Manila, but do their own EDSA here in Cebu. And when a radio station announced a fund drive in order to raise money to help the people who are in EDSA, I mean, they raised something like 60,000. It's a big sum. In the first, I think, 2 hours when the fund drive was started, a lot of people contributed. And that, in fact, there was somebody who went to the radio station donating 12 sleeping mats to be sent to Manila so that the the people who are camping out on EDSA would have like sleeping mats to sleep on because they're of course sleeping on the streets on EDSA. But anyway, kind of there was a really a kind of popular support for what went on in EDSA, and kind of people were disappointed because they had planned on staging a large demonstration here, but then the word came that Marcos had already left the country, so they were not able to do their own kind of mass gathering here in Cebu. So, so this was kind of, in a sense, uh, even as early as the 1980s, 82, 84, kind of there are already demonstrations here in in uh, in Cebu. So in a way, kind of this again sustained the the kind of idea that kind of Cebu is kind of anti-Marcos party. But of course, what how you know how things turned out, kind of Bongbong Marcos won in Cebu, so like kind of shows you how strange Philippine politics uh, can be. That in a sense, kind of something that people could not imagine happening has happened. Kind of. So in a way, kind of. Uh, in conclusion, what one cannot, like, speaking of how Cebuanos conduct themselves or behave or react to political crisis, political challenges, cannot really be kind of simplified into kind of, you have to analyze, kind of a lot of things, the nature of the crisis or challenge, what the imperatives and alternatives are, and and uh, and so on, and that you really cannot speak of Cebuanos as constituting, a single homogeneous community. There are understandably kind of, uh, divisions and fissures in that community. But kind of it's interesting to reflect on kind of uh, kind of the question of kind of whether one can see patterns and tendencies that, in a sense, would make Cebuanos, to a certain extent, definably distinct from people of other regions in terms of how Cebuanos deal with political challenges. So I shall stop there because kind of I think we need time for the questions. Okay.
Daghang salamat, Sir Resil. Uh, we are now in our Q&A. It is very interesting that the talk of Sir Resil actually tells us that we should not really think of Cebuano as or Cebu as the opposition country. We really thought that for a long time, no? But and then, of course, the recent election showed us that it's really different. But in history, actually, we see that Cebu does not really have a pattern at the first instance when the Spanish with the Spanish arrival and Spanish colonization. Um, there was the two opposing natures of resistance and acceptance, and then in the 1898 revolution in Cebu, we find out that prior to that, uh, 1896, Cebu was actually forced the Spaniards, and then in 1898 we find out that the leaders who we thought uh, who were actually for the Spaniards were not the ones leading the uprising at in 1898. So, and then we find out in martial law that with that very interesting detail about the election of the interim batasang pambansa, we have that shutout, complete shutout of that opposition party called Pushon Bisaya. It's very interesting, sir. And then we find out, of course, now that in the recent election, we were not, Cebu was not really opposition country. But sir, is given this, sir, would you still be able to say that, or can we even say, uh, because if you think about it, sir, at the start, at the onset of the Spanish colonization, what was highlighted for us, for Cebuanos, was actually Lapu-Lapu, and then in that Lapu-Lapu was opposition in a sense. So was that like carried all throughout? Or was that because the reason why it was highlighted, that we're highlighted as opposition country, because also of that sort of answer murag, it started with that banggod, so it became like a symbol for us, or it stood for Cebu.
I'm not sure whether there's a direct connection, but I mean, I think part of the reason why kind of you have this creation of kind of the idea of kind of Lapu-Lapu as hero is that kind of I think again Nick Joaquin was kind of I think mentioned something along this line that kind of about how we don't really have a few we only have a few victories to celebrate, you know, that kind of what we kind of mark as historical events. I think it's like, for instance, the fall of Bataan and so on. Kind of, we don't have as many events to commemorate that represent a triumph on the part of the Filipino, and so like also in like developing the kind of in a sense the myth of nationalism. It's important to find that this is rooted in events as that means very early on. I mean, and we can't find anything really perhaps earlier than Lapu-Lapu. So Lapu-Lapu becomes both an, im- a needed figure of kind of Philippine nationalism, as well as a figure that we need to celebrate Filipino heroism, bravery, and kind of triumph over kind of colonial, kind of European or Western imperialism, and so on. So kind of Lapu-Lapu satisfies an important need. So I mean, in a sense, that's the kind of the kind of build up of Lapu-Lapu as hero, because kind of I think that's the kind of important thing. Like, kind you have to kind of distinguish between the demands of heritage and commemorations as against hard history. Kind of kind of heritage usually kind of there's a need for like some inspiring figures and so on. So there's a tendency to dress up certain historical characters, probably in a idealized way, because they are needed as inspirational figures when like a closer look at these figures in fact do not kind of completely support their being regarded as you know kind of as heroes. So I so so the question of like, you know, what was Lapu-Lapu fighting for, you know? And and what motives did Humabon, on the other hand, have with respect to kind of the for responding to the Spaniards' arrival in that particular way. Why did he consent to be baptized and so on? And when you think about it, like of course, at the time of Lapu-Lapu, there was no kind of a Philippine nation did not exist, and the idea of nation as we know it today did not exist. That's why it's anachronistic to call him as a father of Filipino nationalism, because in a sense, he was fighting to defend his small island of Mactan, which is it's a small island, but it was a very important island because essentially the local struggle between Humabon and Lapu-Lapu had to do with control of the channel, which was important for trade. So that's why Lapu-Lapu, that is what makes Mactan important. I mean, Mactan, you can see very clearly doesn't really have any resources, no? So what makes it important is its location in what is an important waterway, an important which is the channel. So that like if you control Mactan, you can intercept incoming vessels even before they come to Cebu. And of course, piracy was a lifeblood of the pre-colonial economy. So who controlled locations like that? I mean, that was very important for for building power for the leader. So I think the feud between Lapu-Lapu and Humabon is largely about it's really a story of local politics rather than kind of like if you think of it now as like resistance against Western that's a contemporary reading of the event. But if you think about it as to what it meant in the context of that time, it really was a essentially a battle for local supremacy in Cebu. So in a way, Humabon is not perhaps should not be seen as a complete and out and out villain in the same way that but kind of that's in a sense not very convenient for purposes of commemoration and so on, if you look at it in those terms.
Before we move forward, sir, maybe I have one more, sir. But during the time of martial law, sir, and you mentioned about how the Pushon Bisaya actually won over the popular party. In after that, sir, in the 19 you said you mentioned in the 1980s, early 1980s, there were still demonstrations ongoing. Uh, was Pushon Bisaya also leading that at that time?
I think that Pushen Bisaya really in a sense dissipated or fragmented very quickly. And but it was not it was not it was a party just set up for the purposes of the election. There's not really much of a party. It was like just a a collection of people who came together to in a sense contest the state of martial law. So so it did have really like anything any long term aspirations and so on. But by the 1980s, you must remember there was in a sense a loosening of controls, as it were, on the part of the Marcos dictatorship. In fact, 1981 was when, in a sense, martial law was lifted. Although it was as people point out, it was more like a paper lifting, for cosmetic purposes. But there was of some relaxation of the of authoritarian rule. So in a sense, there was some opening by the 1980s for people to kind of begin to mount public protests and so on. But it's again, this was, I think, in many ways like EDSA, because kind of EDSA is was largely kind of, it was a popular uprising, but it's largely middle class led, right? Kind of, I mean, the in a sense, the leadership of EDSA was really kind of, in a sense, not kind of the poor, the poor, but large kind of in a sense, largely a middle class uprising, and in many ways that's true of Cebu as well, because kind of the by that time there were like kind of already uh, started organizing like uh, as I mentioned earlier, it means Cebu kind of, when you say opposition as country, it's largely opposition in the sense of kind of liberal democratic opposition, not kind of radical kind of really type of opposition represented by, say, the National Democratic Communist Party of the Philippines. It's more like kind of traditional kind of.
Yeah.
You'd have like, I think Marcelo Fernan was involved, kind of like Democrito Barcenas. I mean, those types like lawyers and kind of already like political leaders who had kind of fallen uh, by the wayside because of martial law. They started to regroup and reorganize by the 1980s. So in by the 1980s, there were already kind of demonstrations. You've heard of, I think you remember some of the Neta Cruz de Luz, kind of radio personalities, kind of Olganza, those types. So they were kind of so that was beginning to happen in the 80s, even before the Aquino assassination.
Sir, what happened to the influential people, the names you mentioned, the Osmeños, the Garcias, prior to the 1986 revolution and after that interim election that they lost?
Uh, I mean, you will recall the kind of, if I remember correctly, because I may have kind of, my memory may not be as sharp on this point. Sergio Osmeña Jr. was in the U.S. when martial law is declared, right? So of course, the head of the Osmeña family was Serhing, meaning Sergio Osmeña Jr. or Serhing. He was the one who fought Marcos in the 1969 election. So he was the primary opposition figure at the time. And I mean, I can't recall this very clearly, but he was in the U.S. for medical reasons or something. But when martial was declared, he was out of the country. He was out of the country, and so he did not return and spent the martial law period, or much of the martial law period, in the U.S. And that's why he died. And Sering Osmeña died uh, in the U.S. Also, he had been weakened by the fact that he was severely wounded in the Plaza Miranda bombing. So that, in fact, I saw him in L.A. where he was living. I can remember now when this was, probably like 1980, 81, because I was in the US at that time. I decided I was going to see Osmeña in order to arrange an interview with him for the Cebuano Study Center. So, since I was just passing through, I had an American friend, a political scientist, based in LA, that I took along because I was planning that this American would interview Serhing. And so we went to see him in his condo unit in LA, and I we are I arranged the interview to be conducted by this American professor, and the interview was actually completed. It was done over a period of 3 consecutive weekends. So we had like a 5 hour long recorded interview with him. And so that was, so in a sense, he was completely out because he was in the US. Tommy Osmeña was also in the US because during or much of martial law, I can't remember the exact uh, times. Um, Sonny Osmeña was also in the US, but he came back. I think he was the, came back early before the others. So Serge Osmeña, who was groomed to be Sir Hing's successor, because Tommy Osmeña was still like kind of a very young, he was still a teenager. Okay, so the one who was really groomed to succeed Sir Hing was Serge Osmeña, and Serge Osmeña, as you know, was imprisoned together with Henry Lopez,
Yeah.
Lopez, kind of,
There's
and they escaped.
yeah,
Kind of
there's a
that.
movie even about that, sir.
So they escaped from their prison from either the Fort Boniface or something, and then kind of were able to go to the U.S. So the Spaniards were out of commission during the martial law period. In fact, for a time, Sani Osmeña, and even kind of, I mean, the Osmeñas tried to strike a kind of accommodation with Marcos because kind of like Lito Osmeña was here all the time, but he was kind of, I think, under house arrest for a long period. So, in fact, that's, I think, the reason why he was one of the KBL candidates because they were probably trying to arrive at some accommodation with the Marcos because the Marcos Marcos was really after the Osmeñas. So they're out of the picture during Macho Martial Law. Sunny Osmeña returned only kind of I, I can't remember the year, but he was kind of shortly before 86 he came back, and when Aquino assumed as president, Sunny Osmeña was appointed OIC mayor of Cebu, and that's kind of uh, the beginning of their return to
Return.
power in Cebu.
All right. Thank you, sir. We have questions from our audience. And so we'll begin with the first one. This comes from Junie Lee Arthur 11. Thank you for your question. Were there specific instances or events when the provincial elite were in conflict with the city elite prior to the revolution?
This prior, what do you mean? To the prior to martial law or prior to
I think this is the revolution
the
in the
anti-Spanish
1898. Yeah,
when
anti-Spanish.
the provincial
Were there
instances.
instances?
No, the political situation then under the Spain was that provincial governments were headed by kind of Spaniards. The highest public office that a native, as it were, a Filipino can assume was being mayor of a town. You know, like the like so Cebu up until the end of the Spanish period, the governor was always was always was always always a Spaniard. So uh, so there was no, in effect, there was no the battles in or the political contests were at a strictly sub-provincial level because kind of kind of in a sense Filipinos or kind of uh, could only kind of in a sense aspire for the highest post was becoming in a sense mayor of a town. So in a sense that was where the in a sense like kind of political contests were taking place. Kind of there was no contest at the provincial level because these were reserved for these were reserved for
Yeah.
Spaniards. But the case of Cebu is, I think what should be appreciated is that by the late 19th century, by over the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, insofar as I mentioned this already, insofar as the city is concerned, which was really kind of what was important. I mean, not much was happening in the towns. I mean, kind of like trade, for instance. I mean, Cebu kind of since prospered because because the the city was a transshipment point for goods coming from
Mm.
other parts of the Visayas. So it's really kind of the really important site was the city of Cebu. You know, the towns really did not figure so much in the in the in the history. So and the the natives or Filipinos, I mean, like by Filipinos, we mean already kind of Chinese mestizos, Indios, and so on. Those kind of, in a sense, uh, what the kind of used in the current sense, like Filipinos really kind of in if kind in effect control the city. I mean, because they were the wealthiest kind of residents of the city. The Spaniards did not this because the Spaniards to begin with there were not too many Spaniards, particularly by the early 19th century. There were very few Spaniards. I think the Spanish population of Cebu increased only in the last decades of the 19th century, probably like 1870s, 1880s. That's when the the Spanish population in Cebu like increased. But for much of the Spanish period, there were very few Spaniards in the city and in the province. Outside of the priests and the soldiers, there were very few Spaniards residing in the city. So in a sense, the locals themselves, meaning like Chinese, particularly Chinese mestizos and some Indios, they were the ones who controlled practically the economy of the city. Meaning like, why would they be interested in staging a revolt against the Spaniards when they already, in a sense, owned the city? You know, in fact, I wrote an article on which was inspired by an article that I read in Il Bulletin de Cebu of the celebration of a fiesta in the city. And a highlight of the fiesta was a dinner which gathered, in a sense, the most influential people in the city: the provincial governor, the alcalde, meaning the mayor, the city council, and then the heads of the religious orders. So I was struck by the article because it struck me that, but this is almost like a portrait of who's who in Cebu. I mean, who's the most powerful people in Cebu? It's here, these people who are at this dinner. And that's why I wrote an article on that, built around that particular dinner. And I mean, most of those who were gathered at that dinner table were Filipinos. You know? So that's why, like, kind of, if they were loyal to Spain in 1896, it was because they were already a kind of a privileged uh, group in the city. So the remarkable change is in the last, would say, 2 decades of the 19th century, because the size of the Spanish population increased, and so there became tension between Spaniards and locals. But prior to that time, the kind of in a kind of Cebu became a Spanish, in a sense, colonial city only a few years before the Spanish rule ended. So,
Yeah, so it's all about motives, sir.
yeah.
Right. You mentioned that. Okay, let's go to our second question. This comes from Kyle Andre Ibones. Thank you for your question. Given the records of Cebuano elites and Inteligencia, who initiated an uprising during the 1890s. Can we consider Cebu City as an Ilustrado center at that time? Why or why not?
That's a good question, yes, because I had um, this at one time I was thinking of after I wrote the book Brains of the Nation, and I was thinking of like I don't. These are all kind of. I mean, I don't have any Cebuano characters in the book, so I was thinking of like. But the fact is, Cebu in the 19th century was not really an Ilustrado uh, center. It was a kind of, a kind of Ilustrado center on the southeastern, because the only school of higher education in Cebu to begin with is Seminario Colegio de San Carlos. Right? And San Carlos started to accept lay students, meaning it was, for much of its history, it was a seminary. So it was a school to train priests. It was only, I can't recall the exact year now, it's only by the 1870s that it started to open its doors to lay students, meaning students who were enrolled not necessarily to become priests, no. But so it started to accept lay students only in the, I think, beginning in the 1870s, and it was not a degree granting institution, meaning what was that students would study at San Carlos and then complete, in a sense, kind of much of what we call the college level education. But they have to go to Manila for one final year, usually studying Litran or I think Santo Tomas, before they can get a degree. Because Santo Tomas was the only degree granting institution in the whole country, meaning it was the only degree granting institution in the Philippines. That's why, like, you can attend San Carlos, get much of your coursework done, but then you have to spend one additional year studying either in Litran or I think Ateneo, uh, and one year before you can get a degree granted by Santo Tomas. So this means that kind of it's not it did not have kind of the facilities for becoming a kind of Ilustrado center like uh, like Manila. And in fact, uh, for instance, the case of the Philippine Revolution, Filipino priests played an important role, as in the case of the Gomborsa martyrs, no, Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, kind of, in a sense, the beginning of Filipino nationalism. In the beginning of the Filipino nationalism, kind of Filipino priests played a key role, isn't it right? So, but the priests educated in San Carlos, which was kind of the only institution for like Central Eastern Visayas, Northern Mindanao particularly. Uh, there was not much discontent on the part of Filipino priests in Cebu, because you remember that in the case of the Gomez Burgos Zamora case, that the first issue that really galvanized kind of the beginnings of Philippine nationalism was the secularization movement, in the sense that the secular priests did not have as many opportunities for advancement, because kind of uh, the important offices in the church were monopolized by Spaniards, so that like Filipino priests could only become coadjutors in many cases, so they become priests, and so on. But in the case of Cebu, the reason why we don't have much discontent in the clergy, in the Filipino clergy. I mean, there were cases, but not in the same degree as, for instance, in the Tagalog provinces, was because majority of the parishes in Cebu were already controlled by Filipino seculars, meaning the only parishes that were controlled by the friars were, of course, the richest, like Santo Niño, which of course was the richest kind of church. So Karkar had a Spaniard, I think Talisay, but all the other towns, the smaller towns, were all so those in a sense not much cause for the local priests to be active in kind of the reform or
Yeah.
in the movement or in the revolution. So
So we're
so,
saying, sir, that Cebu was not illustrated country because there was no means for higher.
also because kind of one, for instance, uh, the first when did the first newspapers in Cebu appear? El Bulletin de Cebu came out, I think, in the 1880s, already late, and that was a Spanish language newspaper owned and edited by Spaniards. And in fact, kind of, if you read the issues of Il Bulletin de Cebu, it was almost like it reads like it was the organ of the Spanish community in Cebu. So, and then when was the first printing press established in Cebu? It was also around that time, like Imprinta de Escondrillas came out in the 1870s or something. So which means that the press, publishing, journalism arrived in Cebu already towards the end, almost like as the Spanish period was about to end, isn't it, right? So, and then in addition, Cebu is really quintessentially a city of merchants, kind of. And I think that character of Cebu has remained for a long time, even to a certain extent, perhaps today, that because Cebu's lifeblood is trade, meaning it's really a city of merchants, meaning unlike like Iloilo, I think Iloilo has more the character of an aristocratic city because yeah, kind of Iloilo, because you have a kind of in fact Iloilo was really the queen of city of the south up until the last years of the 19th century, because Iloilo was kind, in a sense, the more kind of the wealthier city, and also the more kind of, in a sense, aristocratic city. Cebu was kind of very bourgeois, kind of merchants and so on. Although Cebu started to overtake Iloilo as the queen city of the south by I would say 1890s, or as the 19th century ended. So I think Iloilo had more the character of an ilustrado center than, which is kind of in many ways the character of Cebu, and probably part of the explanation why basically Cebu is kind of conservative. It's not kind of, hmm, it's not, it's not. Doesn't seem to be like kind of a place where you would have radical politics flourishing, kind of as we said, like kind of the even the anti-Marcos opposition here was kind of more like middle class type opposition than anything else. I mean, this is interesting to consider. Like I was mentioning this, although this is rather speculative. I said, I think something can be read about the character of the Cebuano from even the looking at the patron saint of Cebu. Mm. And in fact, somebody actually wrote an article, because I suggested that, about comparing the Santo Niño de Cebu and the Jesus Nazareno of Quiapo, as kind of, because they are it's a stark contrast. On one hand, you have the Black Nazarene, and kind of the of of the dead Christ, right? Kind of, and the kind of patron saint that would arouse really strong, intense emotions, which is shown in the annual procession
Yes.
of the Nazareno. Kind of, but think about the Santo Nino in contrast. I mean, you have a child, as a patron saint. I mean, you go to the museum of the Santo Nino Museum, and when I went for the only time actually I was there was uh, I was what the thing that struck me was that there was an exhibit in on one of the cabinets a collection of plastic cars, mga toys. You have like old church vestments, old novenas, religious images, and then in one cabinet, and so when I I was struck that this collection of like plastic toys, and when I inquired as to why they were there, these were like things that were given by devotees, because after all, like if you the devotee is the image is a child. What do you give to a child? You know, a plastic card. So I mean, the one's patron saint and the devotion around that saint must have some effect on your personality as well, isn't that right? So that whereas the Black Nazarene in Quiapo arouses such strong emotions, here it's much more laid back and kind of. And what are the stories about the Santo Nino, the legends? Like stories about a mischievous child. I mean, so that must have an effect on the personality of the Cebuano as well, which is also like I think partly a condition is that I think generally island people are much more kind of you know kind of.
Mm.
I thought people in who live on islands tend to have a much more
Laid back, sir.
yeah
Yeah.
compared to like kind of the Ilocanos and so it's all kind of speculative, but it's interesting to think in those terms as well.
Yes. Wow, sir, you have given us something to think about. But we're down to our last question, I believe. Can we show it? This question comes from Cedric Campilio. Thank you very much for your question. Good afternoon, Dr. Mojares. Cebu, as what you mentioned, was an opposition region during the Osmeña versus Marcos elections. And ironically, today, his son won in Cebu. Does this show that the history that we have didn't instill, or rather, well, yeah, didn't instill to the Cebuanos, or is it somewhat a historical amnesia, a form of historical amnesia?
I've not really thought about. I've not really thought about it because, to confess, I even did not vote in the last election. I felt it's just a personal review. Kind of felt kind of the so depressing that I decided. So anyway, so I'm not really kind of how how did that come to? I suppose there's not a single explanation, but you mentioned the historical amnesia. I think that's kind of part of the part of the reason. I think it's commonly said that Filipinos have a very
Sir, memory.
short historical, very short historical memories. In fact, I think the best anecdote to illustrate that is again something that kind of my friend Michael Lenin has written is you recall in the I think probably in 1960s it's not so anymore, but do you do you know this expression panahon ni mampur?
Mm.
No, it's not as popular today as it was in the I think 60s, 1960s, and I don't know when that started, but what panahon na mampor means is like I mean, so you say like panahon po man ni mampor. It's like kind of
Dugay na.
old ancient times. That's the popular Cebuano expression, ancient times. Now, Mike Cullen, this American historian, heard that, and he said he heard that quite often when he was here, and he was wondering who is this Mampor? I mean, like kind of, because obviously it refers to a person. And then he discovered, and I think he's perfectly correct, uh, that Mampor actually is an actual historical person. He's the name is Joaquin Monfort, a Spaniard who was the mayor of Cebu sometime in the 1890s. He was also head of the Guardia Civil, but he became mayor of the city also at the time of the, I think at the time of the revolution. So that when actually in probably when that expression started, when people say panahon ni Mampor, they were thinking of the time of the revolution. Hmm? Uh, like the time of Mampor, Joaquin, the Bisayanized Joaquin Monfort, Mampor. So when we say that panahon pa ni Mampor is like in the time of Moses or so on, but it actually refers only to the 1890s, which means that in the 1960s or 1950s, when they say in ancient times, panahon pa ni Mampor, in the Cebuano memory, a lapse of what, something like just 50 years is already ancient history. So that's why, like, if we, of course, we cannot say panahon pa ni Marcos would be ancient history because Marcos has returned. No? But it shows that historical memory is very shallow, and that our ancient times happened only 50 years
Yes.
50 years ago. So that, I think there's something to be said about the shortness of historical memory.
Yeah. That was our last question, sir. And it's very interesting that when Sir Resil answers a question, we get more actually than the answer itself. So, but we'd like to thank, of course, Dr. Resil Mojares, national artist, for taking the time to be with us this afternoon and for accepting our invitation to talk about the topic. And for that, sir, we'd like to present to you our certificate of appreciation and for sharing your expertise and time as resource speaker of our webinar today. And this is our last actually webinar for the year. And this is given on the 22nd of July here at the Rafi the Kabilin Center, Cebu City, signed by Rafi President and CEO, Miss Amaya Boitis Fansler. And we'll send this to you, sir. And thank you very much again, sir. And hopefully we get to see you in another probably talks, or in fact we'd like to also invite you to the Gabii sa Kabilin in October. Hopefully you will see you there, sir. And we'd like to also thank all our GSK partners, Gabii sa Kabilin partners. And of course, I'd like to thank the GSK Organizing Committee, Melka, Renren, Sig, Verla, and Mac, and Nikki, our intern. And we'd like to tell our audience that there is trivia, 5 questions for our trivia after our webinar. So please stay tuned for that. And we'd like to remind everyone, for those who want to get an e-certificate for for attending this webinar, please fill out the evaluation and the link will be posted right after this webinar. And of course, we'd like to thank our audience, especially our teachers who are here and the academic staff of the Maria Montessori International School in Talamban and Gorordo campuses. They really sent us a message that they're very interested to join our webinar this afternoon. Like I said, we just announced that there will be a Gabii sa Kabilin. It's really the physical event. Many have been waiting for this, and it will be in October 21. And we just posted, of course, that we have started the selling of our tickets. The early bird rate is 180, but if you buy it after September 21, you will be already paying for the regular price of 200. So please get hold of, we posted a list of all the museums that will be participating on the October 21 Gabii sa Kabilin run. You can buy your tickets from them. And of course, that ticket is We'll give you access to all 20 museums that are participating in the GSK this year, and with unlimited bus rides and one Tartanilla ride. And of course, you should not miss the many presentations, performances, and activities that will be going on in all of the 20 museums that are participating in the Gabii sa Kabilin. So we hope you will see you there, and don't forget, you can already buy your tickets now, starting today. And with that, we will close this webinar. Daghan kaayong salamat for those who joined us this afternoon. And keep safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time and for participating in our webinar today. We hope to see you again next month for another Gabii sa Kabilin online activity to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage. Please don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, daghang salamat!
placing the entire Philippines under martial law.
I've ordered the arrest of those directly involved in the conspiracy to overthrow